The silver spoon clinked once against the rim of the porcelain cup, its sound swallowed by the heavy hush of dusk. Outside, the rain drew delicate lines down the window panes, casting moving shadows upon the parlor's faded walls. She moved quietly between the chairs, her figure half lost in the lace of twilight and steam. Miss Eleanor Wickham, 28 years of age, held no rank, bore no inheritance, and wore no satin. She was neither family nor servant. She was there, as she had been for 8 years, serving tea precisely at 7, every evening, in the third drawing-room of Belcroft House. The household did not speak of Eleanor, not directly. She had once been the late Duchess's companion, a term invented for women who had nowhere to go but were too educated to scrub floors. After the Duchess's passing, Eleanor simply remained. She read in the library by morning, walked through the orchard alone by noon, and served tea to the Duke and his guests at night. She was addressed as Miss Wickham, with the tone one uses for a faded portrait, acknowledged but never examined. Belcroft House was always thick with visitors, ladies with gauzy gloves and perfumed letters, gentlemen who laughed too loudly at the Duke's comments. No one noticed Eleanor's slender fingers as she poured each cup. No one looked at her hands, though they trembled slightly on Thursdays, the day the Duchess had died. No one remarked on how she knew everyone's preference without ever being told. The Duke of Marrow, Benedict Alderton, was younger than most expected, 35, striking in stillness and utterly unreadable. He rarely spoke during tea, except to offer brief pleasantries. He did not smile often, but when he did, it caused the room to lean toward him like flowers to the sun. He never directed that smile to Eleanor, never until that night. The wind shifted. A draft moved through the corridor as the butler left the doors ajar. The clock struck 7. Eleanor lifted the teapot once more, her wrist steady now, pouring the amber liquid with care. As she moved to place a cup before the Duke, her eyes met his briefly, and held, just for a breath. Then, as if the world had stumbled over a single tiny step, he said something that shattered the routine. "May I sit with you this time?" The room went still. The guests blinked. A lady's fan stopped mid-wave. The sound of the rain seemed to pause. Eleanor's hand remained mid-air, the cup trembling faintly on its saucer. She said nothing. He did not smile. And yet everything had changed. The whisper of his question seemed to echo through the room far longer than any ordinary phrase should. "May I sit with you this time?" It hovered in the air like a challenge to gravity, testing the limits of tradition, propriety, and memory. Eleanor blinked once. She did not nod. She did not smile. But she stepped back, as if making space for something no one could see. The Duke did not wait for approval. He simply stood, slow and deliberate, and moved to the empty chair beside the tea table. Her chair. Gasps were swallowed into handkerchiefs. Lady Finchley, a cousin thrice removed and perpetually overdressed in lilac, nearly choked on her petit four. Mr. Harold Millstone, a portly gentleman with political ambitions and a poor memory for names, cleared his throat with theatrical indignation. The Duke sat beside Eleanor as though it were the most natural thing in the world. He did not speak again. He did not glance around to gauge the reaction. His presence, however, caused the very rhythm of the evening to falter. No one asked for more sugar. No one refilled their own cups. They watched a woman in plain wool, with ink-stained fingers and a quiet gaze, sit beside a man whose title could have made her vanish with a word. Eleanor looked ahead, toward the fire. Her profile was fine and unremarkable, except to those who truly looked. There was dignity in the slope of her neck, resilience in the way she kept her hands folded in her lap. She did not lean into him, nor away. She offered nothing to make his gesture easier for others to dismiss. "So," said Lady Finchley, her voice as sharp as her hatpins, "the weather's been quite dreadful, hasn't it? Makes one wonder if God himself disapproves of July." Several guests chuckled too quickly. "Yes," the Duke said flatly. "Dreadful." He did not look away from Eleanor. The silence returned with a kind of vengeance. It hung like mist in the corners of the drawing-room, curling around ankles and confidence alike. Lord Greystone, seated opposite, attempted to engage Mr. Millstone in a debate about corn tariffs, but their voices sounded brittle and strained, like music from a warped violin. Eleanor remained composed, her breath steady, though her eyes betrayed something flickering, surprise, perhaps, or disbelief, or a quiet calculation. The footman entered with more pastries, but no one touched them. When the Duke reached for his teacup, his fingers grazed Eleanor's. Not by accident, not long enough to be called improper, but enough to ignite an invisible current that turned the heads of every unmarried woman in the room. "Tell me, Miss Whitcomb," he said, voice low, "have you read Persuasion again this year?" A longer silence followed. No one had ever heard him ask her anything, not even once. "I have," she said finally, her voice quiet but even, "twice, in fact." "And still you prefer to Emma?" Eleanor turned to him slowly. There was no smile on her lips, but there was a flicker of something softer in her eyes. "Always." The moment settled like dust on velvet. Lady Finchley dropped her fork. The guests realized belatedly that they were witnessing something they had no script for. The rules they knew, the ones that governed seating charts and conversational topics, and the invisible lines drawn between class and connection, were quietly crumbling beneath their shoes. By the time the hour passed and the tea cooled, the social order of Belcroft had changed. No declarations had been made, no improprieties committed. And yet, when Eleanor stood to clear the cups, she did so slowly. Deliberately, the Duke did not rise, but his gaze followed her, not as a man watches a servant, but as one watches a thought he cannot unthink. The guests, once emboldened, now chose silence over comment. They did not mock. They did not tease. They waited for something, for anything. And in that waiting, something had already begun to break. Long before she served tea in the third drawing-room of Belcroft House, Eleanor Whitcomb had once stood in a sunlit conservatory, trembling with joy as a younger Benedict Alderton pressed a pressed violet into her hand. They had been little more than strangers then, he a second son with no title yet, and she the paid companion of his mother, just turned 20, clever and quiet, with poems hidden in her apron pocket. It had been early spring, before death and inheritance and war had rearranged all of England. Back then, he had walked with her not out of necessity, but curiosity. He had asked what she thought of Voltaire. She had replied with a quote from Addison, and he had laughed. Not the amused chuckle reserved for ballrooms, but something real, raw, and delighted. For 3 weeks, they had shared stolen mornings. She had once caught him brushing his hand against hers as she shelled peas on the rear terrace. He had offered to bring her a book from London, The Romance of the Forest. She had never asked for it, but it arrived anyway, tucked between 2 deliveries of wine. Then came the accident. His elder brother, Viscount Alstone, had died of fever after a hunting fall. The household wore black. The new heir became distant, formal. His letters, which had once appeared in her drawer with no explanation, ceased entirely. Eleanor did not ask. She did not cry. She merely folded her memories into silence and turned her face toward her duties. The late Duchess, stern but not unkind, had seen what others pretended not to. "He is the wind now, my dear," she said one day while brushing ash from her morning skirts. "He must move through the trees as they bid him." Eleanor had nodded. But do not let the wind convince you that you are a leaf. That winter, when Eleanor's only relative, her younger sister, died of consumption in Bath, it was the Duchess who held her hand through the telegram's delivery. And when the Duke returned months later from his tour of Europe, he did not visit Eleanor. Not once. He greeted his mother. He resumed his new title. And to Eleanor, he said only Miss Whitcomb when they crossed paths in the corridor. She had learned to be invisible then. It was a skill that wore itself comfortably, like an old shawl. She poured tea at the correct temperature, remembered the birthdates of his dogs, and kept to the margins of rooms. Her heart became something buried, a fossil beneath civility. But at night, when the house grew still and the lamps were trimmed low, she would walk barefoot into the library and run her fingers along the spine of The Romance of the Forest. Its pages were worn soft with memory. She had never opened it since the day it arrived. And then, 2 weeks ago, the Duke had stopped at the threshold of the drawing-room before tea. He had not come in. He had not spoken. But he had looked at her, not past her, not through, at. Something behind his eyes had stirred, like leaves shifting before a storm. She had felt it. Then he had turned away. She had spent days trying to forget that look. She had failed. And now, with his question still echoing in her mind, "May I sit with you this time?" The past was beginning to peel through the surface of her present like ivy cracking stone. She knew what this was. Attention from a duke, especially one who had once offered her violets, could burn through a woman's reputation faster than scandal ever could. And yet, she also knew this. There had been no mistake in his gaze. No charity. No accident. That made it dangerous. More dangerous than she could yet allow herself to name. In the quiet days that followed the Duke's question, Belcroft House buzzed with whispers dressed as pleasantries. The morning room, the gardens, even the chapel pews, all became stages for speculation. "How curious that Miss Whitcomb was seated beside him," said Lady Finchley with a knowing sniff. "How curious indeed," echoed Miss Smythe, who had once tripped on purpose near the Duke's study door. Eleanor, however, moved unchanged. She still rose at dawn, still watered the Duchess's garden, still arranged the tea service with the same precise grace. But there was one difference, unseen to the world, yet unfolding beneath its very nose. The night after the Duke sat beside her, Eleanor walked to the east wing, where few dared go since the Duchess's passing. The corridors there held more dust than footfalls. She reached the third door on the right, Lady Alderton's old study, and unlocked it with a brass key few remembered she had. Inside, everything remained untouched. The faint scent of lavender oil, the curled edges of correspondence from India, the chair with its cushions still indented. Eleanor sat at the desk and drew out a box of letters. Not her own, the Duchess's. They had written often to a solicitor in Manchester, a Mr. Horace Vale, a meticulous man, trusted in the final months of her illness. The Duchess had insisted that Eleanor accompany her during every meeting with Mr. Vale. She had said little during those sessions, merely offered tea and carried notes. But she had listened and remembered. She now reread those letters by candlelight. Beneath the floor of politeness, the meaning unfurled like a trapdoor. Changes to the estate's trust, amendments to a secondary deed, certain stipulations should her son ever marry again, or, perhaps more critically, should he not. There was mention of a private endowment in Eleanor's name, for her discretion and her years of loyal service, though we dare not call it affection. The Duchess had left affection between the lines. That same evening, Eleanor took another walk, this time to the stables. She did not take a horse. She approached the stable boy, Matthew, whose mother she had once nursed through fever, and whose father now served as footman. "Would you ride to Manchester for me, Matthew?" she asked softly. "To Mr. Vale. This letter must reach him, and he will know what to do." She handed him a sealed envelope, unremarkable in weight, but heavy with consequence. Matthew blinked. "Will I need to wait for a reply, miss?" Eleanor shook her head. "He will come." 2 days later, a discreet carriage arrived at Belcroft just before dawn. No crests, no footman, the wheels muffled with cloth. Mr. Horace Vale, thin and quiet and dressed in a coat that smelled faintly of old ink, was led not to main hall but to the old schoolroom, where Eleanor waited with a fire already lit. They spoke for an hour. No voices were raised, no documents signed. But when he left, he pressed her hand longer than solicitors should, and said only, "I shall return when it is time." Later that week, the household noticed something peculiar. The Duke, usually distant at breakfast, asked after the condition of the North Cottage, a building rarely used since the gardener's retirement. "Perhaps we should refurbish it," he murmured. "It might serve a purpose soon." A purpose. The word floated between meanings. And in the shadows of the corridor, a chambermaid saw the Duke pause at the drawing-room entrance again. He watched Eleanor as she arranged the cups. He did not speak, but something in his posture had changed, as if waiting for a signal, as if he too had begun a quiet preparation, unseen, yet gathering force. The evening began like any other. The drawing-room glowed with lamplight, filtered through gauze curtains and the soft gleam of polished brass. Laughter dripped from corners brittle and careful. The guests had gathered once more for tea, not because they were thirsty, but because they could not resist watching for the next turn in the silent play that had begun between the Duke and Miss Wickham. Eleanor moved with quiet assurance, her movements so practiced they felt like breath itself. Yet something in her expression had changed. Her eyes no longer searched the floor, and her hands did not tremble. She wore a dress of soft gray muslin. Nothing extraordinary, until one noticed a delicate embroidery along the sleeves. Violets, tiny stitch violets, the late Duchess's favorite. The Duke entered last, as always, but tonight he walked with a deliberate slowness, a kind of measured gravity that pulled attention toward him. He nodded to his guests but did not speak. He took his usual seat, then looked up and said very clearly, "Miss Wickham, would you join me here, please?" A ripple swept the room. No whisper followed it. The silence was too taut. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then moved to sit beside him. This time, not at the edge of the tea table, but directly to his right, in the chair that had once belonged to the Duchess herself. Lady Finchley blinked as though slapped. Mr. Millstone's cup rattled in its saucer. The Duke reached into his coat pocket and drew forth a sealed envelope, thick, cream-colored, and bound with an unfamiliar wax seal. He placed it on the table before him and said, "I have a matter to address." No one breathed. He looked to Mr. Greystone, the family solicitor, seated on the far side. "You have a copy of this letter, I believe?" The old man gave a single nod. "I do, Your Grace." The Duke turned his gaze to the room. "It concerns a secondary trust established by my late mother, the Duchess of Marrow. Many of you may not have known existed. It was never announced, nor added to the formal estate documents." He paused. That was by her design. There was a shifting of skirts. Lady Finchley's mouth twitched, caught between confusion and calculation. The Duke continued. "The trust, executed in her final weeks, names Miss Eleanor Wickham as a primary beneficiary of a considerable endowment and grants her legal authority over the North Cottage and adjoining orchard." Gasps broke loose, soft, immediate, unguarded. Miss Smythe whispered, "But she's just—" The Duke cut across the room with a glance. "She is the person who sat at my mother's side as she died, who held her hand in the final hours, who has lived in this house in silence and dignity for nearly a decade. My mother knew her value." Lady Finchley narrowed her eyes. "And you, Your Grace? Do you?" The Duke turned very slowly to Eleanor. His voice dropped in register, not for intimacy but gravity. "Yes, I do." He picked up the envelope and handed it to her. Eleanor took it calmly, though her fingers hesitated as they closed around the thick paper. A long silence followed, broken only by the slow strike of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then Greystone stood, unfolded a separate document, and began to read. "The provisions of the secondary trust are to be enacted immediately upon verbal acknowledgment by the Duke, witnessed by two unrelated parties." He looked up. "That condition has been met." The room was still. Eleanor remained seated. Her eyes were lowered, not out of submission, but focus. And in the silence that followed, the Duke's hand rested on the table between them, not touching hers, but near, close enough. "I hope this does not upset the harmony of our company," he said at last. Lady Finchley laughed once, dry and sharp. "Harmony is not the word I would choose." Eleanor finally looked up, not at Lady Finchley, but at the fire across the room. Her voice was low but clear. "Perhaps, then, it is time we stopped pretending there was ever harmony to begin with." The room flinched, and in that moment, the image of Belcroft, the hierarchy, the silence, the false civility, began to fracture. They came for her that night, not with torches, but with smiles. Lady Finchley was the first to move. She rose from her chair as if led by divine outrage, the lace at her throat trembling with the weight of her indignation. "Your Grace," she said crisply, "surely you do not mean to reward, encourage such presumption. A servant, however well-spoken, should never be emboldened to sit where a duchess once reigned." The Duke did not reply. Miss Smythe, emboldened by Lady Finchley's attack, stepped forward. "If Miss Wickham is to be a lady of property now, Perhaps she will also require an introduction to London society? Or should we revise our invitations to exclude those whose birth is too uncertain? Eleanor remained seated, her back straight, hands resting calmly on her lap. She did not speak. Then Mr. Millstone, who fancied himself a guardian of tradition, folded his arms with great drama. It sets a troubling precedent, Your Grace. Next we shall see governesses in Parliament and housemaids choosing their suitors. There is order to these things. Eleanor turned her gaze to him. It was not sharp, but it silenced him all the same. But it was not until Lord Greystone spoke that the tone shifted entirely. You would all do well to recall, he said slowly, that Miss Wickham is named not by whim, but by will, a legal document witnessed, signed, and sealed. Her position is not a gift, it is law. But she's nothing, Lady Finchley cried, breaking her own mask of restraint. She's no better than a kept woman, an ornament the Duchess allowed out of pity, and now she's to be set above us. The Duke stood. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He said only, Lady Finchley, I believe your carriage is waiting. Gasps spread like a contagion. Lady Finchley flushed. You cannot mean... I do. Belcroft will no longer host those who mistake cruelty for correctness. The butler, silent until now, stepped forward from the hallway with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for the command. Miss Smythe backed toward the hearth, her lips parting, searching for a lifeline. Your Grace, surely there's no need for her. The Duke turned to her. Miss Smythe, you are not dismissed, but you are observed. Her knees gave a soft quiver. No one else spoke. Eleanor, though silent through it all, became the room's new axis. She did not gloat. She did not bow her head. She simply was, with the composure of one who had already known what it cost to be underestimated. As the guests departed in uneasy waves, the house grew quieter, yet more solid, as if something old and rotted had been swept away. Later, in the small blue room adjoining the library, the Duke found Eleanor standing by the open window, the wind lifting tendrils of her hair. You did not defend me, she said, not accusing, simply noting. He stood behind her, but did not touch her. I did not need to. I did not want inheritance. I know. There was a pause. I wanted only, she continued, to be acknowledged. The Duke exhaled. Then let this be a beginning. She turned to face him, the envelope still unopened in her hand. Or an ending, she said, and the weight of the moment hung between them, poised, undecided. That night, Belcroft did not sleep. Servants passed through the halls more quietly than usual, carrying whispers on their backs. Footmen lingered near doors they would not open. In the west wing, the housekeeper wept behind a locked cupboard, not for sorrow, but for something more complicated, relief, perhaps, or the unraveling of loyalty long bound to silence. In the second guest chamber, Miss Smythe sat with her hair unpinned and cheeks streaked with tears, scribbling a letter to her mother in Surrey. The letter was never sent. She tore it up before dawn, but the words had already carved themselves into her. Lady Finchley left just before midnight. Her carriage wheels carved deep furrows into the soft gravel, and her final words, flung through the doorway like a curse, were, You shall regret this, Benedict. The Duke did not answer. He watched her go with no satisfaction, only weariness. In her small room near the east staircase, Eleanor sat by the fire with a sealed envelope on her lap. She had not yet opened it. Her fingers had lingered at the edge of the wax, but something in her refused to break it just yet. She remembered the way Lady Finchley's voice had trembled, not from rage, but from disbelief, to be dismissed by a duke over her, a woman without pedigree or protection. It would echo across the county. Invitations would be rescinded. Daughters would be warned. But none of it compared to the moment after, when Eleanor found herself alone in the blue room, and Mrs. Forsythe, the housekeeper, a woman with stiff joints and an iron spine, entered without knocking. She looked at Eleanor not with scrutiny, but with tears unshed. I knew, Mrs. Forsythe said softly. She loved you like her own. The Duchess. Eleanor nodded. I loved her, too. The housekeeper crossed the room, lifted Eleanor's hand in hers, and kissed it. It was the smallest act, but it cracked something in Eleanor's chest she had held too tightly for too long. Later, as moonlight crept across the floorboards, Eleanor stood before the looking-glass and studied her own reflection. Not out of vanity, but to see what the others refused to. The woman who had endured. She did not see beauty. She saw truth. In another wing of the house, the Duke sat alone in his study, a single candle burning beside an untouched decanter of brandy. His coat was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled above his wrists. He held a letter of his own, one never sent, written in Vienna years ago. It bore her name. He read it twice, then placed it into the fire. For all the titles, all the authority, there had been no dignity in his silence these past years. He had watched her carry the weight of the Duchess's death, of solitude, of whispered contempt, and done nothing. Until now, when morning came, the guests who remained avoided her gaze. They did not apologize, but they did not speak cruelly. Not anymore. And in the library, where light streamed through the east window, Eleanor finally broke the seal of the envelope. Inside were 3 documents. One, a letter, in the Duchess's hand, written in shaky script. Let no one call her servant. She is the reason I died unafraid. Another, the deed to the North Cottage. And the third, a personal note in the Duke's handwriting. This is not a gift. It is a return of what should never have been taken. Eleanor wept then, not loudly, but fully, and for the first time in 10 years, she did not hide it. The carriage stood at the edge of the gravel path, its wheels hushed by the damp earth. It was modest but finely kept, dark blue with polished trim, the same shade once favored by the late Duchess. The household had assembled at a distance, curious, tentative. None had been summoned, yet all came. They stood like statues under the gray July sky, uncertain whether they were witnesses to a departure or a coronation. Eleanor descended the front steps slowly. She wore no bonnet. Her hair, braided and pinned, was not adorned by ribbon or comb. Her gown was simple cream muslin, but her bearing, her stillness, made it feel like silk. In her gloved hand she held only one object, the sealed letter from the Duchess, now read and folded back into its envelope. The Duke waited beside the carriage. He was not dressed for town. No top hat, no gloves. Only his dark riding coat, collar open, boots dusted from the stables. His face was unreadable, except in the eyes. They betrayed something like awe, tinged with grief. "You're not trying to stop me," Eleanor said softly. "No. Then you know I must go." He nodded once. "Yes." A beat of silence passed between them. In the stillness, a distant horse snorted, and the wind rustled to the linden trees. Eleanor stepped closer. "I am not leaving in disgrace, Benedict," she said, and it was the first time in years she had spoken his name aloud. "No," he replied. "You are leaving in full view." A moment hovered, suspended between breath and consequence. Eleanor looked toward the North Cottage, its roof just visible beyond the hedge. "I will return," she said, "when the papers are filed. When my name is mine again. You never lost it. That is generous of you, but it isn't true." He looked down, then stepped back, allowing the footman to open the door of the carriage. "Eleanor," he said, voice low, "when you return, will you still refuse me?" She turned her head, slowly. "I never refused you." The words landed with the force of confession. He said nothing more. She stepped into the carriage, settled herself, and drew the door shut with her own hand. The driver, sensing the moment's edge, clicked the reins softly. The wheels turned. As the carriage began its slow descent down the gravel path, no one waved. No one spoke. But they watched, every eye fixed on her. Not because she had taken something, not because she had triumphed, but because she had become visible at last, and there was no way to make her invisible again. Mrs. Forsythe dabbed her eyes with a corner of her apron. A stable boy removed his cap. Even the house itself seemed to lean after her, its stones holding their breath. In the carriage, Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight. She did not look back. She did not need to. For the first time in 10 years, Belcroft was behind her, and she was not leaving as a shadow, but as herself. The days that followed her departure fell into an uneasy quiet. Belcroft remained stately, its routines preserved, but something in the air had shifted, like a mirror long fixed to a wall now missing, leaving only the imprint of what once was. Lady Finchley's name was struck from the guest ledger. Her embroidered handkerchief, accidentally left in the music room, was returned without note, wrapped in plain linen. Rumor had it she had tried to rally the neighboring ladies into a letter of protest, but none signed it. None dared. The Duke, for his part, was seen less in the public rooms. He no longer hosted tea, nor joined the dinners. Instead, he rode early and wrote late, his study windows lit past midnight. The staff whispered that he kept Eleanor's note in his breast pocket, that he had cleared the East Library shelves where the Duchess's letters once sat, that he now walked, alone, through the orchard at dusk, her old path. The North Cottage, once forgotten and overrun with ivy, was transformed by the third week. The shutters were repainted, the garden trimmed, and a woman from the village was hired to launder the curtains. When asked who would live there, the Duke replied simply, "The woman who owns it." In town, the solicitor, Mr. Vale, moved briskly through the registry office. The clerks, curious as ever, watched as documents were submitted under a new legal heading. Miss Eleanor Wickham, of independent means. Her name entered the records with no attached title, no male relation, just herself. The society pages, always hungry for novelty, turned her into a fascination. The Duke's companion, or the companion Duke, asked one particularly daring column. Yet no retraction or denial followed. The Duke neither confirmed nor corrected. He let the silence speak. At Belcroft, changes followed quietly. The portrait of the late Duchess was moved from the grand staircase to the library, its frame cleaned, its gaze made softer by proximity. The drawing-room chairs were rearranged, the one she had sat in left empty, facing the fire. The servants noticed a shift, too. Footmen no longer corrected themselves when addressing her name in conversation. The housekeeper replaced the oldest tea set with one the Duchess had once reserved for family. When asked why, she said Miss Wickham preferred it. Not everyone adjusted with grace. Some guests did not return. Dinners were fewer, quieter, but those who stayed behaved differently, less assured, more watchful. The hierarchy had been unsettled, and though the old order clung to the walls, it no longer held their backs so straight. And in the Duke's study, beside a silver pen stand, lay a letter, not sealed, not sent, just waiting. Eleanor, it began. The rooms echo more sharply now. I see you in every stillness. By the end of the week, a small parcel arrived from London addressed to the Duke. Inside, a press violet, and a single line written on ivory paper. I have not refused you. I have remembered. He read it once, and then again, and then gently he placed it in the drawer where he kept the Duchess's final letter, folded beside a lock of Eleanor's hair she had given to the lady once, long ago in trust. The rain returned to Belcroft in August, soft and persistent, as though the sky itself wished to remember what had changed. The orchard glistened in the mornings, dew hanging like beads from the leaves. A hush settled over the estate, not of absence, but of waiting. One morning, a chambermaid opened the blue room shutters and paused. On the writing desk, untouched since Eleanor's last evening in the house, lay a teacup, cold, still half full. No one had the heart to move it. Dust gathered at its edge like a sigh. That room remained closed after she left. No order was given. It simply became understood. In the Duke's study, the fire burned more often now, even in summer. He had changed little in habit. But the staff noted the softening of his tone, the way he no longer rushed conversation. At times, he paused in mid-sentence, as if listening for a sound just out of reach. Once, in the orchard, a young gardener asked him, timidly, "Would she return, sir?" The Duke had not answered. Instead, he plucked a leaf from the branch above and studied its veins. "She never truly left," he said at last. In town, Miss Wickham, no longer half-hidden, took rooms in a modest townhouse with ivy on the sill and a writing desk beneath a bay window. Her name began to appear in quiet places. At the lending library, on the roll of patrons for a new orphanage, on the letterhead of a women's reading circle in Manchester. She did not hold court. She held dignity. Those who remember her only as a background figure at Belcroft now found themselves reconsidering the spaces they had filled with assumption. Her silence, once misread as submission, had become a mirror. In her absence, they saw themselves. At Christmas, a parcel arrived at Belcroft, wrapped in thick brown paper and tied with dark ribbon. Inside, a book, The Romance of the Forest, first edition, its margins filled with Eleanor's handwriting, notes, reflections, and quiet laughter frozen in ink. The Duke read it cover to cover in one sitting. He did not weep, but when he closed the book, he pressed it to his chest and remained still for a long while. Later that winter, a second deed was quietly recorded, transferring half ownership of Belcroft's library and orchard lands to Miss Whitcomb. No announcement was made. The house, however, responded in its own way. The footman began preparing her tea service again, placing it near the fire at precisely 7. No one claimed the act. It simply resumed. By spring, the violets bloomed early. In the library, an old cushion had been moved to a chair near the fire, the same spot she had once sat during the Duchess's last season. No one spoke of it, but every afternoon at the same hour, a figure would pause there, sometimes the Duke, sometimes a housekeeper, sometimes no one at all. And still, no one dare mention her name again. But every room remembered her.